Hi, everyone. And here we are again, getting close to the end now, aren't we? But this is really awesome. A couple of really good stuff coming up next, and I know you can't wait to hear about it. So today we're going to talk about regulation. And regulation is not fun. You may have been aware already that I'm not a fan myself, but but it exists, and so it's good for us to talk about it and talk about the economic effects of that. So without further ado, we'll just get right into it. Oh, there we go. Clicking the right button will help on it. All right, so here we are on our lovely whiteboard, and there are three types of regulation. First type is social regulation. Social regulation, this is the type that focuses on health, safety, and the public good. So these are the regulation that would say you're not allowed to, that would say that a company is not allowed to dump toxic waste into a waterway, a public waterway. That one I am in favor of. So, just because I'm not in favor of regulation as a whole doesn't mean there isn't some cases where it makes sense. And in this case, it does. So it does definitely something like that. So it deals with protecting the rights of others. Okay, so if you're focusing on health and safety, I love this saying that someone told me once that said, "Your rights end where mine begin." Made perfect sense to me. So it's one thing, that's why there are designated smoking areas as opposed to just having people the way they used to just smoke anywhere, because you're infringing on someone else's rights. So that's the type of regulation that deals with the social aspect. And we're not going to talk too much about that because ours are the things we're involved. The next two deal more with economics. So the next one has to do with what's called a natural monopoly. And natural monopolies, markets that have a cost structure such that a monopoly makes sense. All right, they have a cost structure such that a monopoly makes sense. Those are the examples that I used before in the monopoly. Kind of ironically, that those were the ones like the underground transportation system, like our MARTA or the New York subway, and also the electric company with the power lines and all that stuff. A monopoly makes sense to have those, or that makes sense for that market to be a monopoly. The reason why that makes sense in terms of the reason why that makes sense in terms of their cost structure is that their long run average cost is continually downward sloping. So it looks something like this. All right, so you've got your demand curve. And then you will have your marginal revenue. And your long run, your marginal costs and your average costs are going to look something like this. So I'm going to draw them and then go back and label, okay? So you've got like that, and another not like that, okay? So this is your long run average cost, and this is, oh, let's change the color here, long run marginal cost. All right, so instead of looking like that dipper there, for the marginal cost, your long run one is going to be downward sloping. Same thing for your long run average cost. And in fact, actually it will slope downward. I drew it. My tendency, of course, is to continue to draw it up, but it's actually going to draw even down even further. So more like, you can draw it more like that. Okay. And same thing with your marginal cost. So it's continually going down. But for this company, that's a good thing. All right, so you can still have your marginal revenue equals marginal cost if you want to price it, and come back up and do it that way for the price. So you can still do it that way, but you see we're getting up into the much higher portion of the demand curve, because look at all this profit that you get here. You've got a lot of profit up here, and then it's just your costs are just continually going down. So the more you produce, the lower those costs, the more profit you're going to make. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's good to make profit, but in this case, it gives you the opportunity to price so high, because you're not going to have any, you'll price so high because you will never have any competition, and you know that. So your long run average costs are decreasing due to infrastructure limits. And what I mean by that, once the infrastructure is in place, they have no major costs other than occasional repairs and maintenance. So they'll have to do maintenance, they'll have to do repairs, but otherwise they're not going to have any major costs. They've already outlaid the major costs right there. All right, so also, all firms must price where their costs are covered. If they are forced to price equal marginal cost, they would have too much loss and shut down. An example for that is the post office. So if you're forced to price a price equal to marginal cost, so if we're forcing them to price, all right, so their demand is right here. Let's extend that demand curve just a little bit more. All right, so let's say, all right, so it's a necessity. It's something like the post office or the electric company, some of those things, and then we're going to make them price right here at price equal marginal cost. So that's right here where their demand curve equals their marginal cost, and that's a very low price, you see? And that low price is going to be below their long run costs right up here. So it's going to be below their costs, so that's not going to work for them. And so they have too much loss, which is all this right here, and they're forced to shut down. So their cost structures are such that not only does a monopoly make sense, but they, there's quite a difference there, so that they have to price up at a certain level in order to cover their costs. Okay, so they have to price up at a certain level, but they also, they can't price too low either. They're not going to have any, and they will never have any competition, or they shouldn't have any competition. Post office right now, they are having to, you remember from the article from your homework assignment, they were having to they were having to they were being forced to price low to be competitive, and then they end up having too much loss to shut down. Sorry, I had something occurred to me that I will deal with later. All right, so what are your options? Well, your options are the government can subsidize the loss. So they can do that. They can either, they have to get some dollars, so they have to either raise taxes or cut spending. So that's one of yours. Another one, you can set your price equal to your long run average costs. So you can do that. You could bring the price up here to long run average costs. That would be like right there to set it up here. You could do that, but that's not going to give you any economic profit, and you have to have the economic profit in order for resources to not be repurposed into something else. All right, because if not, then business people, they're going to want to repurpose the resources. So you have to have it like that. Okay. All right, so that's the second type of regulation. Let's look at the third. Number 3 is antitrust. Antitrust regulation. And antitrust, what these do, these laws prevent monopoly, cartels, collusion, and other factors inhibiting competition. Okay, so they prevent all those bad things that would inhibit competition. Now, trusts, these came out in the late 1800s. So if you ever watch those old documentaries that were around in the early 2000s, I guess, that called The Men Who Built America, and that's about people like the Rockefellers, who we've been talking about, the Vanderbilts, J.P. Morgan, people like that, the ones who actually built industry into what it is today. If you go back and you've watched those documentaries, they formed trusts. That this is what we're talking about right here. And so what trusts were made of? These were competing firms in the same industry. Let's write it all down, and then I'll come back and we'll discuss. They set policies for the industry. Well, I guess I'll discuss and you'll listen, right? Sorry. And this was an early form of lobbying. And so in essence, what it did was it turned an industry into a monopoly. Okay, so they're made up. So basically what was happening, you had these competing firms in the same industry, and they said, you know what, guys, we can continue to cut prices and try to outsell each other and try to steal market share from each other and all those things, but all we're doing is we're ending up costing us money. We're costing us money and nobody's making a profit. Instead of that, why don't we get together all in the same industry? Let's divide up the market share and let's all set our price at this certain level, and we'll just operate these same policies. We'll all operate by the same set of rules, so and just divide the market share equally. And other people were saying, hey, yeah, that sounds good to us, let's do that. Well, that's fine until other and I didn't object necessarily to what they do. I happen to think that I agree with what was in that Star Wars movie that Liam Neeson said, there's always a bigger fish. Or in this case, there's always a small little annoying fish that's going to come and turn the industry up on their ears, like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates did in the tech industry. But back in those days, it was different, and people were still kind of figuring it out. The resources are not there, and the business community was much, much smaller. So this was considered, so this was fine. These trusts, they rocked along okay until a new a new firm wanted to come into the industry, if there wanted to be some more competition. And then these trusts were getting in the way. All right, so these trusts were getting in the way. They were preventing that from happening, and it was unfair. And the new firm coming in could make things better on the consumer. So if you want to look at it back then, actually, them keeping firms out was in fact inhibiting competition. They were preventing market forces from working. So if you want to look at it that way, it is more capitalist. These antitrust laws started out being capitalist. That may be massive rationalization, but we'll go with it right here. And watch out, because that might end up being, if I gave essay questions, that would be one I would give. But I don't give essay questions anymore. So you all dodged a bullet on that one. All right, so in 1888, Congress wrote the Sherman Antitrust Act. And it was named after the senator that wrote it. His last name was Sherman. And what this act did, it prohibited trusts, trade restraint, monopolization, and that's it. So it prohibited trust, trade restraint, and monopolization. It was actually very vague and not useful. Now, these trusts, remember what I said up here, notice what I said, it's an early form of lobbying. So if these trusts are an early form of lobbying, and then this, it wouldn't surprise us to see that this is vague and not useful, because, Congress was also, not immune to the charms of the business community back then, just like they're not now. So that's, that they came up with this act that just kind of played a little lip service to it, but didn't really do anything helpful. So in 1914, it was amended by the Clayton Act. And so the Clayton Act amended, added to the Sherman Act. All right, so what it did, all right, and you know what? We are going to start on another page. Let me write that again for you. I want to have more room up here. I was afraid I was going to run out of room. All right, so what the Clayton Act prohibited, it got way more specific. And so it prohibited these things. First one is something we just talked about, price discrimination. And price discrimination is charging the same price, charging different prices, charging different prices for the same goods. There we go. So it prohibited that. So in other words, you can't take people's consumer surplus anymore. It prohibited tying contracts. And tying contracts, these require the buyer of one good to purchase another as a package. So the buyer of one good has to, you want one good, but to buy that one good, you have to purchase another. So for example, when iPhones first came out, they were under an exclusive contract with AT&T. They were only available to customers who bought their cell service through AT&T. So therefore, if you wanted to buy an iPhone, you had to have your cell service through AT&T. That's a type of tying contract. And before you start asking, how can they get away from it? How can they get away with it? We'll get to that in just a moment, okay? So the tying contracts. All right, next is exclusive dealing. And exclusive dealing is when they must agree not to buy from other suppliers. So for an example with that, this isn't a bad example necessarily, but Starbucks, well, Barnes & Noble, if you go in there, they have a coffee shop and it has a sign up that says Starbucks. It is not a Starbucks. The Barnes & Noble coffee shop, it is just a regular coffee shop owned by Barnes & Noble. But in order to sell Starbucks coffee, Starbucks products, they are agreeing not to buy Dunkin' Donuts coffee and set it up right there with the Starbucks. If you want, it's either Starbucks all the way or nothing. So that's one example of that. And of course, there are many others. That one's not a bad one. There were many that were much better, or that seemed harmful, shall we say. Now, interlocking directorates, that's the next one. And this is when you have common directors on the boards of competing firms. All right, so if you have common folks on the board of directors for these different firms, like if you had somebody that was on the board of Coke and Pepsi, that would be illegal. Can't imagine that happening, but apparently it did with some companies, because it is here. All right, acquiring competitor stock is the next one, meaning you can't buy them out. You can't buy up your competition. So you can't buy them out. You can't merge with them if you're and be the dominant firm. You can't acquire your competitor stock and thus bend them to your will. Nothing like that. You can't just simply buy up your competition. Now, this also established the Federal Trade Commission, which is also known as the FTC, if you've heard this. Right, and this, it is established to enforce these laws and is appointed by the president. All right, so the Federal Trade Commission was established to enforce these laws, and the president appointed them. Now, an example of that is good old John D. Rockefeller, and I think I introduced y'all to him and said we'd talk more about him later. Well, now it's later. And John D. Rockefeller, was the one who kind of started this whole thing. He was the one that took this stuff to a new level. Now, personally, I kind of admire old John D. And that brings up the question that I like to ask students. And this is the point where I really wish that we were in person, an in-person class, because I always ask, well, was he being a bad guy? Was he being unfair, or was he simply being a good businessman? Was he just doing what any businessman should be to do? Make a healthy profit and use whatever means you have available to you. Certainly today's standards, we buy competitors. People buy their competitors all the time. It's not illegal. Nobody gets arrested for that necessarily. Now, they will sometimes undo a deal in some cases, but for the most part, people do that. It happens. You'll see that happen. Walmart does that all the time. They run out of business. They'll run out Ace Hardwares and smaller locations like that out of business all the time because they can undercut their pricing. So let's talk about what they do. So John D. Rockefeller, his company was Standard Oil of New Jersey, and they are kind of the gold standard of creating a monopoly. And it was from gas stations and things like that. So it's kind of a cool story. If you read more or listen to more about him, you'll find it interesting. So what he did too, he acquired 120 competitors. All right, so he had it going on right there, and engaged in something else that was not mentioned up here in the Clayton Act, but eventually it did amend. The Clayton Act was amended to put it up there. Predatory pricing. And predatory pricing, this is when you temporarily setting your price less than marginal cost, just like in the graph that we just looked at a minute ago, to undercut competition and force them to shut down. So you set the price less than marginal cost. So you're not making any money. In fact, you're losing money, but you're a big company. You can afford to do that. That's just like, someone who eats regularly and maybe even overeats a little bit. You can miss a couple of meals and be okay. Some other folks may not do so. That's probably a bad example, but it's the one that came to mind. I personally don't want to miss any meals, so maybe that was a bad example. But then you force them to shut down. So you can outlast them because you have the resources to make up those losses from somewhere else, but your smaller competitors, they don't have that. Therefore, they shut down. And that's one of the things that Walmart does. Now, how does Walmart get away with it? Walmart comes into a town and they undercut all of their competition. They go out of business, and then that's that. So how does Walmart get away with it? Well, Walmart, and they've effectively created a monopoly. Walmart, it's price leadership. They say, nope, it's not. We're not undercutting. We're not using predatory pricing. We are instead, we're the dominant firm. And there's some truth to that. I mean, I can't take up for John D. Rockefeller and not take up for Walmart too. So I get that. And as a customer, if I like having the smaller businesses around, that's where I need to go spend my dollars, right? I'll lecture myself on that one. All right, so what are some of the problems? All right, so we just talked about modern examples of this. So why is there not more lawsuits? And the truth is, there are a lot of lawsuits, and you can look them up. There's some out there right now that we see. I just have an article here. This is from several years ago that Cinebistro sued AMC theaters because AMC was saying, if you don't give us exclusive rights, they were telling the film companies, you give us exclusive rights to your blockbusters, or we're not going to show any of your smaller films either. And that so that was a problem there, and Cinebistro sued because of that. So there are antitrust lawsuits out all the time. AT&T constantly gets that. But let's see, what are some of the problems then? But some of the problems is it takes time to complete an investigation. Most people just get bored. They get tired of it. It takes some time to complete an investigation. People have already moved on, and the deal they found another way around it. They found a workaround or something along those lines. So that doesn't work. Another is that the natural cost structures drive out competition. So it's like what we looked at in a natural monopoly in that setting. So the natural cost structures drive out competition. It's just like with the natural monopolies. So natural monopolies, they say those need to be regulated because they're just going to naturally drive out competition. That was where that second form of regulation came from. Also, technology itself creates natural monopolies. This one is kind of cool. And eventually breaks them down. So looking at things like IBM and Microsoft, technology creates monopolies, it builds them up to break them down. It's really fascinating that way. So technology, IBM had the patent on the technology. They were the only one that developed it, and then they had two competitors come in and broke them down. The post office had a monopoly, and competition came in. You had FedEx and UPS, but that didn't completely take away everything. They didn't deliver mail. You still had to have a post office to pay your bills and things like that. So, but technology did break them down. Now we have the internet. People pay bills online and they send emails and stuff. So technology does create the monopolies and breaks them down. And that's one of the things I was talking about with the bigger fish line too. There's always a bigger fish or a small annoying fish. There's always something that's coming down. Monopolies, unless they're natural monopolies, that doesn't stand. And even with natural monopolies, sometimes that breaks down as well. Technology will break them down. Like with the phone company. Now we have wireless. Back when the phone company was wired, it was the same as the electric company. There were all these cords and power lines and things like that. And so therefore it didn't make sense to have um, it didn't make sense to have competition in that. They were a natural monopoly. Technology improved, and now they're not anymore. So there's no telling what will happen, especially with the electric company and all that. Who knows? And maybe with the underground transportation system, perhaps someday they'll have a beam me up Scotty type thing, you know, a transporter. Who knows? Could happen. All right, and then finally, the last one cannot be enforced on international firms. All right, so it cannot be enforced. That was one thing we were talking about with the cartels and everything. We look at the cartels and we say, okay, well, um, you know, they're not going to listen to us. We say, all right, don't do that. That's illegal here. Okay, what are you going to do about it? Well, nothing apparently. So you can't enforce our laws on international firms, and so therefore, you know, a lot of companies that are based overseas or just move their base to another country if they really want to engage in these practices. Not a lot we can do about that. And then with the time it takes to complete an investigation, that's plenty of time to move your base of operations overseas. All right, so that gets us through regulation. This was a short one. The next one coming up is about government. It's going to be a short one too. And then we'll have international and we'll be about done. So enjoy. Have a great time. Have a good afternoon, evening, good night, and I will see you next time.